Thomas Carver, Chicago's billionaire king, built his empire on solitude, until a mysterious letter reveals a son he never knew and a past he buried. What secrets threaten his unshakable world? A millionaire marries a rebellious girl on a bet, only to discover she is hiding a secret that could ruin him, a story of honor and redemption. Like and subscribe for more. Keep the light burning. The city of Chicago stretched out beneath Thomas Carver like a glittering tapestry, its lights pulsing against the night sky beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 47th floor office at Carver Industries. At 55, Thomas stood at the helm of a tech empire he'd built from the ground up, a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and headlines alike. Tonight, the air smelled faintly of polished oak and expensive cologne, the faint hum of success vibrating through the sleek modern space as the board members toasted to their latest triumph, a billion-dollar acquisition that cemented their dominance in the industry. Thomas raised his glass, the crystal catching the glow of the recessed lighting overhead, his lips curving into a practiced smile. The room buzzed with murmured congratulations, the clink of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter from men and women in tailored suits. Yet beneath his crisp white shirt and navy tie, his chest felt hollow, a quiet ache he'd long learned to ignore. Success, he told himself, was its own reward. Dignity came from standing alone at the top, untethered by the messiness of human connection. "Thomas, you've outdone yourself again," said Evelyn Harper, the silver-haired CFO, her voice warm, but sharp, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "This deal's a masterpiece." He nodded, his gray eyes steady. "Discipline wins wars, Evelyn. We stayed the course." The words were his mantra, etched into every decision he'd made since he was a young man scrambling out of a crumbling Chicago tenement. Discipline had carried him here, to this glass and steel tower where he could look down on the world that once looked down on him. But as the board dispersed into smaller conversations, a shadow moved through the crowd. Daniel Pierce, lean and sharp-featured, his dark suit clinging to him like a second skin. Pierce had been Thomas's rival for 2 decades, a man who thrived on chaos where Thomas built order. "Well, well," Pierce drawled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his voice cutting through the hum like a knife. "The king of Carver Industries reigns supreme. Another notch on your belt, Tommy." Thomas's jaw tightened at the old nickname, but his face remained a mask of calm. "It's Thomas, Daniel, and yes, it's a good night." Pierce smirked, stepping closer, his hazel eyes glinting with something predatory. "Good night indeed. You've got the money, the power, the headlines. But tell me, Tommy." He paused, letting the words hang like a noose. "Who's waiting for you at home? Or are you still too grand for that?" The room didn't fall silent, not exactly, but Thomas felt the shift, a subtle tilt in the air as a few heads turned. Pierce's barb wasn't loud, but it was precise, a needle aimed at the one crack in Thomas's armor. He took a slow sip of his bourbon, letting the burn steady him, his mind flashing to a memory he'd buried deep. Claire's voice soft and pleading under a street lamp 25 years ago. "Stay, Tom. We can make it work." He'd walked away, his footsteps echoing on wet pavement, because love was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when survival demanded everything. "I don't need anyone waiting," Thomas said, his tone, even his gaze locking with Pierce's. "I've got what matters." Pierce chuckled, low and mocking. "What matters? Money? A corner office? You're a genius at making billions, I'll give you that. But you're a lonely bastard, aren't you? No family, no kids, just a throne and no one to share it with. What about that girl you left behind, the one from the old neighborhood?" The mention of Claire hit like a fist to the gut, but Thomas didn't flinch. His fingers tightened around the glass, the only sign of the storm inside. He could still see her, brown curls damp with rain, eyes wide with hurt as he turned his back. She'd been his first love, the one who saw the man beneath the ambition, but he'd chosen the climb over her. Honor, he'd told himself then, was in proving he could rise above his roots. Now, Pierce's words scraped at that certainty, exposing a wound he'd never let heal. "Some of us don't need a cheering section to feel whole," Thomas replied, his voice smooth as steel. "I don't live for applause, Daniel. I live for results. Pierce raised his glass, a mock salute. Results. Right. Keep telling yourself that when you're staring at an empty house. You've got the world in your pocket. But who needs you, Tommy? Who really needs you? The question lingered sharp and unwelcome as Pierce melted back into the crowd, his laughter trailing like smoke. Thomas stood still, the bourbon warm against his palm, the city lights blurring into a haze beyond the glass. He was untouchable. Everyone said so. The board respected him, the industry feared him, and his name was synonymous with success. Yet Pierce's taunt gnawed at him, a splinter under his skin. Who needed him? The answer had always been no one, and that was his strength, or so he'd believed. He drained his glass, the burn grounding him, and set it on a passing tray with a soft clink. The party continued. Laughter, deals whispered over cocktails, but Thomas felt the weight of his solitude more keenly than he had in years. He straightened his tie, smoothed his expression, and walked toward Evelyn to discuss the next quarter's projections. Discipline, he reminded himself. Control. That was his honor, his dignity, the pillars that held him up when everything else had crumbled. But as he moved through the room, the memory of Claire's voice slipped through the cracks again, soft, insistent, like a melody he couldn't shake. Stay, Tom. He hadn't stayed. He'd built this tower instead, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, until the man who loved her was buried beneath the weight of the man he'd become. Pierce could mock all he wanted, but Thomas knew the truth. He'd traded warmth for power, and he'd never looked back. Not until tonight. The lights of Chicago shimmered below, a constellation of his victories, but for the first time in decades, they felt dimmer than they should. He turned away from the window, his shadow stretching long across the polished floor, and rejoined the party. Whatever Pierce thought he'd uncovered, Thomas would prove him wrong. He always did. Honor wasn't in the past. It was in the present, in the empire he'd forged with his own hands. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the expansive windows of Thomas Carver's Lakeshore Drive mansion. From the outside, the place was a fortress of modern elegance, smooth gray stone, glass walls, and a rooftop terrace that overlooked the restless waters of Lake Michigan. Inside it was sterile, pristine, a museum of a life meticulously curated, leather furniture that gleamed under recessed lights, abstract art in muted grays, and not a single photograph to suggest anyone lived here beyond the man who owned it. Thomas stood alone in the living room, a glass of bourbon in hand, staring at the storm as if it could wash away the unease Daniel Pierce had stirred in him the night before. He hadn't slept. The party's noise had faded, but Pierce's words lingered like a splinter. Who needs you, Tommy? Thomas had built his life on the certainty that needing no one was his strength, his honor. Now that certainty felt brittle, cracking under, the weight of a memory he couldn't outrun. Claire's face rain-soaked and pleading the night he'd walked away. He took a sip of the bourbon, the burn sharp against his throat, and set the glass on a marble coaster with a precision that bordered on obsession. Discipline. That was what kept him steady. The soft chime of the mail slot broke his reverie. He crossed the room, footsteps silent on the hardwood, and retrieved a single envelope from the floor. No return address, just his name scrawled in black ink across the front. Thomas Carver. The handwriting was unfamiliar, jagged, as if written. In haste, he tore it open with a flick of his thumb, pulling out a folded sheet of paper that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and time. The words hit him like a punch. Your son is living in Brooklyn. Claire's gone, died 2 years ago. Thought you should know. No signature, no explanation. Just those 3 sentences slashing through 25 years of silence. His breath caught, fingers tightening until the paper crinkled. Claire was dead. And a son. His mind raced back to that last night. Her tearful eyes, her hand on his arm, the faint curve of her belly he'd dismissed as his imagination. He'd left her standing there, chasing a future where no one could hold him back. Had she been pregnant? Had he left more than just her behind? Thomas sank into the nearest chair, the leather creaking under his weight, the letter trembling in his hand. His pulse thudded in his ears, loud against the storm outside. He wanted to dismiss it as a lie, a cruel trick from Pierce or some faceless enemy looking to rattle him. But the detail, Claire's death, felt too specific, too real. His chest tightened, a rare crack in the armor of control he'd worn so long it had become his skin. He forced a slow breath, steadying himself. Dignity demanded he face this, not run from it. He pressed the intercom on the side table. "Linda," he said, voice low but firm, "get me everything you can on a Claire Bennett, last known in Chicago, possibly deceased, and a young man named Ethan in Brooklyn, works with cars. I need it by morning." "Yes, Mr. Carver," came the clipped reply from his assistant, a woman who never asked questions. That was why he kept her. The line went silent, and Thomas leaned back, closing his eyes. Claire. She'd been his first love, back when he was a nobody with big dreams and bigger fears. They'd met at a diner near the old steel mills, her pouring coffee, him sketching business plans on napkins. She'd believed in him, too much maybe. When she'd pressed for a life together, a family, he'd seen chains, not love. He'd walked away, telling himself it was for her sake as much as his, that she deserved better than a man who'd drag her into his scramble for the top. Now, the truth stared back at him in black ink. He'd left her with a child. His child. His. Gaze drifted to the storm outside, rain streaking the glass like tears. What kind of mother had Claire been? What kind of son had he never known? The questions gnawed at him, but he pushed them down, his jaw setting with resolve. If this was true, he'd find out. Quietly, methodically, the way he handled every challenge. No outbursts, no panic. That wasn't who he was. Honor wasn't in the chaos of emotion. It was in the steady hand that guided a storm. He stood, crossing to his desk, a slab of polished walnut that dominated one corner of the room, and pulled a drawer open. Inside was a small wooden box, one of the few relics he'd kept from the old days. He lifted the lid, revealing a faded Polaroid. Him and Claire, laughing under a street lamp, her curls wild in the wind. His younger self looked softer, unguarded, a man he barely recognized. He traced her face with his thumb, the ache in his chest deepening. Claire's gone. The words from the letter echoed heavy with finality. If she was dead, what had happened to her? Had she suffered? Had she hated him? And this son, Ethan, if the letter was right, what did he know of the father who'd never been there? Thomas's hand tightened around the photo, but he didn't let the question spiral. He placed it back in the box, closed the lid with a soft click, and returned to the window. The city lights blurred through the rain, a mirror to the blur inside him. He wouldn't let this break him. Pierce's taunts had been a spark. This letter was the flame. But Thomas Carver didn't burn. He forged. If there was a son out there, he'd find him. If Claire had suffered because of his choices, he'd face that truth. Not out of guilt, but out of responsibility. The quiet, unflinching kind that had built his empire. Dignity wasn't in denying the past. It was in owning it, step by measured. Step. The storm raged on, wind howling against the glass, but Thomas stood still, his reflection sharp against the chaos. He'd spent 25 years proving he needed no one. Now a single sheet of paper had undone that lie. As the bourbon sat untouched on the table, growing cold, he made a silent vow. He'd uncover the truth. Not for Pierce, not for the world, but for the man he'd buried beneath the tycoon, the man Claire had once loved. The lights of Chicago flickered below, and for the first time in decades, Thomas felt the weight of something greater than success pressing against his shoulders. The drive from Chicago to Brooklyn took Thomas Carver 17 hours, a solitary trek through highways lined with skeletal trees and gas stations glowing like beacons in the dusk. He could have flown. His private jet sat ready at O'Hare, but something about the road felt right, a penance in the hum of tires against asphalt. The city skyline faded in his rearview mirror, replaced by the gritty sprawl of New York's outer boroughs, until he pulled his sleek black sedan into a side street off Flatbush Avenue. The air here smelled of oil and rust, a far cry from the polished sterility of his Lakeshore Drive mansion. Thomas stepped out, his polished loafers, crunching on gravel, and adjusted his coat against the late autumn chill. Before him stood a small weathered garage, its sign chipped but legible, Bennett's Auto. A single street lamp cast a pool of amber light over the open bay, where a young man bent beneath the hood of a rusted Chevy, his hands moving with a quiet precision that caught Thomas's eye. Ethan. The name from the letter burned in his mind, and now, seeing the boy, man, really, he felt a jolt he couldn't name. Ethan was 25, lean but sturdy, with dark hair falling into his face and a jaw set hard against the world. His jeans were smeared with grease, his flannel shirt rolled up to reveal forearms marked by faint scars, burns maybe, or scrapes, from a life spent wrestling machines. Thomas stood at the edge of the light watching, his breath shallow. Those eyes, hazel, sharp, alive, were Claire's eyes. He hadn't seen her in 25 years, but he'd know that gaze anywhere, the one that used to soften when she looked at him. The clank of a wrench hitting the concrete snapped him back. Ethan straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, and turned toward the stranger in the shadows. "You lost, mister?" His voice was rough, edged with suspicion, but not hostile. Not yet. Thomas took a step forward, hands in his pockets to steady them. "Not lost," he said, his tone calm, measured, the way he spoke to board members or rivals. "I'm Thomas Carver. I'm looking for Ethan." Ethan's eyes narrowed, the rag pausing mid-wipe. "That's me. What's a suit like you doing in a place like this? You don't look like you need a tune-up." The street lamp flickered, casting shadows across Ethan's face, and Thomas felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This was his son, and he didn't know it. The boy's defiance, the way he stood with his shoulders squared, mirrored Thomas's own younger self, the kid who'd fought his way out of poverty with nothing but grit. But there was something else there, too, a hardness Claire must have forged, a shield against a world that hadn't been kind. "I run a company," Thomas said, choosing his words carefully. "Carver Industries. We're expanding into automotive, tech, diagnostics, that sort of thing. I heard you're good with engines. Thought I'd see for myself." It was a lie. Smooth and plausible, the kind Thomas had mastered over decades of negotiations. He couldn't tell the truth. Not yet. Not until he was sure. Ethan studied him, the rag twisting in his hands, then snorted softly. "Heard about me, huh? From who?" "I don't exactly advertise in your circles." "Word gets around," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the thud of his pulse. "I'm looking for talent, someone who knows machines inside out. You interested?" Ethan tossed the rag onto a toolbox, crossing his arms. "I've got a job here. Don't need some corporate gig. You're wasting your time." Thomas nodded, as if considering the rejection, but his eyes stayed locked on Ethan's. Up close, the resemblance was uncanny. The slope of his nose, the faint crease between his brows. Claire's ghost lived in this boy, and it stirred something deep in Thomas, a ache he hadn't felt since the night he'd left her. He pushed it down, keeping his face impassive. Dignity wasn't in breaking now. It was in holding the line, in facing this truth with the same control he'd always lived by. "Fair enough," he said. "But talent like yours deserves more than a corner garage. If you change your mind, I'll be in town a few days." He pulled a business card from his coat, embossed gold on black, and held it out. Ethan didn't move to take it. "I don't need your pity or your charity, Carver. I'm fine where I am." "It's not pity," Thomas said, his voice firm but not sharp. "It's respect. I don't waste time on people who don't deserve it." Ethan's jaw tightened, but after a beat he snatched the card, glancing at it before shoving it into his pocket. "Whatever. You've seen me. Now you can go." Thomas inclined his head, a silent acknowledgement, and turned back to his car. The gravel crunched underfoot, the sound loud against the hum of the city beyond. He slid into the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, and watched Ethan return to the Chevy through the rearview mirror. The boy's movements were deliberate, practiced, a craftsman at work. Thomas's chest tightened again, pride, maybe, or regret. He couldn't tell. The drive to his hotel was a blur, the streetlights streaking past like memories he couldn't catch. Ethan didn't know who he was, didn't need him, just as Thomas had always told himself he didn't need anyone. But standing there, under that flickering lamp, he'd felt the lie unraveling. Claire had raised this boy alone, poured her strength into him, and Thomas had been a shadow she'd never named. The letter had been right. Claire was gone, and Ethan was here, a living piece of her he couldn't ignore. He parked in the hotel garage, the engine's hum fading into silence, and rested his forehead against the steering wheel. His hands trembled, just for a moment, before he clenched them into fists. No anger, no outburst. That wasn't his way. Honor demanded he face this not with words or tears, but with action. He'd come to Brooklyn to see if the letter was true, and now he knew. Ethan was his son, and Claire's death was a debt he could never repay. The city pulsed outside, indifferent to the storm inside him. Thomas straightened, smoothed his coat, and stepped out into the night. He wouldn't force his way into Ethan's life, not yet, but he wouldn't walk away again either. For the first time in decades, he felt the pull of something beyond success, something that whispered of dignity and responsibility, not power. The streetlights glowed, steady and unyielding, and Thomas vowed to match them, one step at a time. Thomas Carver sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table in the Carver Industries boardroom, the Chicago skyline a gray smear beyond the rain-streaked windows. The room hummed with tension, the air thick with the scent of coffee and leather briefcases. 2 days had passed since his trip to Brooklyn, since he'd stood under that street lamp and seen Claire's eyes in Ethan's face. He'd returned to Chicago with a quiet resolve, the business card he'd left with Ethan a fragile thread he wasn't ready to pull. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. The double doors swung open, and Evelyn Harper strode in, her silver hair pulled tight, her expression grim. Behind her trailed the rest of the board, 6 men and women in sharp suits, their faces a mix of concern and calculation. Evelyn slapped a tablet onto the table, the screen glowing with a headline that made Thomas's stomach clench. Tech tycoon Thomas Carver's secret child? Below it, a grainy photo of Claire, young and smiling, cradled a newborn, her brown curls unmistakable even in the faded image. "Explain this, Thomas," Evelyn said, her voice low but cutting. "The press is having a field day. They've got hospital records. Claire Bennett, Brooklyn, 1999. A son named Ethan. Is this true?" Thomas's hands rested on the table, steady despite the storm brewing inside. He'd known this might come. Pierce's taunts at the party, the anonymous letter. But not so soon, not like this. He met Evelyn's gaze, his gray eyes unyielding. "I'm handling it," he said, his tone calm, measured, the way he'd faced every crisis in 30 years of business. "Give me the details." Evelyn swiped the tablet, pulling up a scanned document, a birth certificate with Claire's name and a blank space where the father's should have been. "It's public now. Pierce leaked it to the Tribune. He's claiming you abandoned them, that you're a fraud hiding behind your billions. The stock's down 5% already." The board erupted into murmurs, a chorus of unease. Thomas raised a hand, silencing them, his face a mask of control. "Pierce wants a reaction," he said. "He won't get one. I'll address this my way." But as the words left his mouth, the doors burst open again and a swarm of reporters flooded in, cameras flashing, voices shouting over each other. "Mr. Carver, did you know about the child? Why did you abandon Claire Bennett? Is this why you've stayed single?" The flashbulbs popped like gunfire, blinding him, but Thomas didn't flinch. He stood, tall and composed, his suit impeccable, his expression carved from stone. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. "This is a private matter. I'll make a statement when I'm ready. Now get out." Security moved in, ushering the reporters back, but the damage was done. The room emptied, leaving Thomas alone with Evelyn and the board, the tablet screen still glowing accusingly. He sank into his chair, fingers steepled, and let the silence stretch. His mind raced, not with panic, but with clarity. Pierce had struck, and he'd struck hard. Hospital records didn't lie. Ethan was his son, and Claire had kept it secret until her death. Now the world knew what Thomas had only just begun to grasp. "Thomas," Evelyn said, softer now, "if this is true, you need to tell us. We can manage the fallout, but we need the truth." He looked at her, then at the board, their eyes pinning him like a specimen under glass. "It's true," he said, the admission steady, deliberate. "I didn't know until this week. Claire never told me. I met the boy, Ethan, 2 days ago. He doesn't know who I am, not yet." The room exhaled, a collective breath of shock and relief. "Pierce is spinning this into a scandal," said Michael Reed, the graying COO. "He's calling you a deadbeat, a hypocrite. Says it proves you're all talk about integrity." "Let him talk," Thomas replied, his voice firm but not sharp. "He's fishing for weakness. I won't give it to him." Evelyn leaned forward, her hands clasped. "The press won't let this go. Neither will the shareholders. You need a plan, Thomas." "I have one," he said, standing again, his shadow long against the wall. "I'll deal with Ethan first, privately. Then I'll face the public. No denials, no excuses. That's not who I am." He left the boardroom, the tablet's glow fading behind him, and stepped into the elevator. The descent was silent, the hum of machinery a counterpoint to the chaos in his head. He saw Claire's face in that old photo, smiling, holding a baby he'd never known. His baby. The ache in his chest deepened, but he didn't let it crack him. Dignity wasn't in hiding from this. It was in owning it, step by measured step. The elevator doors opened to the lobby, where more reporters waited, their shouts a wall of noise. Thomas walked through them, head high, hands in his pockets, his pace unhurried. "Mr. Carver, a comment." "Is it true?" He didn't answer, didn't flinch, his silence a shield stronger than any words. Security cleared a path to his car, and he slid inside, the door shutting out the clamor. Alone in the leather interior, he pulled the Polaroid from his coat pocket, the one of him and Claire under the street lamp, laughing like the world was theirs. His thumb brushed her face, and for the first time in years his eyes stung. She'd carried their son alone, raised him in a world Thomas had abandoned for boardrooms and billions. Pierce could call him a fraud, the press could howl, but the real judgment was in that photo, a life he'd walked away from now staring back at him. He tucked the picture away, started the engine, and drove into the rain-soaked city. The flashbulbs had exposed his secret, but they wouldn't define him. Pierce wanted a fight, a crack in the facade, but Thomas wouldn't give it. Honor wasn't in the headlines or the stock ticker. It was in what he did next. Ethan deserved the truth, and Claire deserved the justice of a father who'd finally show up. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm, clearing the rain but not the weight on his shoulders. Thomas gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, and made a silent vow. He'd face this storm with the same control that had built his empire. Not for Pierce, not for the world, but for the son he'd never known, and the woman he'd lost. The city lights blurred past, a testament to his past victories. Now, they lit the path to something harder, something truer. The rain had stopped by the time Thomas Carver pulled his sedan back into the gravel lot of Bennett's Auto in Brooklyn, but the air still hung heavy with dampness, the street lamp casting a faint halo over the garage's open bay. It was late, past 9, and the city's hum had softened to a murmur, leaving only the clatter of tools and the low growl of an engine to fill the silence. Thomas stepped out, his coat unbuttoned, the weight of the past 2 days pressing against his ribs like a stone. Pierce's leak, the board's demands, the flashbulbs, they'd stripped his secret bare. But he hadn't broken. Not yet. Inside the garage, Ethan worked alone, bent over the same rusted Chevy from Thomas's last visit. The overhead lights bathed him in a harsh glow, picking out the grease smears on his flannel shirt, the taut line of his shoulders. He didn't look up as Thomas approached, his wrench turning with a rhythm that spoke of focus, not anger. Thomas stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, and watched. The boy, his son, moved like Claire had, with a quiet grace that hid the strength beneath. He remembered her fixing a busted radio once, her fingers deft and sure, humming a tune he couldn't place. "Back again," Ethan said finally, his voice flat, not breaking his stride. "What's it this time? Another job offer?" Thomas took a breath, steadying himself. He'd rehearsed this moment on the drive. Every word, measured, but standing here, the script felt hollow. Dignity wasn't in lies anymore. It was in the truth, raw and unpolished. "No offer," he said, his tone even but softer than before. "I came to tell you something. About me. About you." Ethan paused, the wrench stilling in his hand, and straightened. His hazel eyes, Claire's eyes, met Thomas's, sharp with suspicion. "Spit it out then. I've got work to do." Thomas nodded, his gaze drifting to the Chevy. It was old, a relic from the 90s, its blue paint chipped but familiar. Too familiar. His throat tightened as a memory surfaced. Claire leaning against that same car, laughing as he tried to fix a flat tire, her voice teasing, "You're hopeless, Tom." He'd left her with that car, with their future. And now it sat here, a ghost between him and the son he'd never known. "I'm your father," Thomas said, the words steady despite the tremor in his chest. "Claire Bennett was your mother. I didn't know about you until this week, I swear that." Ethan's face didn't change at first, just froze, the wrench dangling in his grip. Then, with a sudden jerk, he hurled it to the concrete, the clang, echoing off the walls. "Bullshit," he snapped, his voice rising but not breaking. "You don't get to walk in here and play daddy after 25 years. Who the hell do you think you are?" Thomas didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. He kept his hands in his pockets, his posture open, letting Ethan's anger crash against him like waves on a cliff. "I'm Thomas Carver," he said. "I loved your mother once. I left her because I was afraid of failing her, of being stuck. I didn't know she was pregnant. If I had, I'd have stayed." Ethan laughed, a harsh, bitter sound, and stepped closer, his fists clenched but not raised. "You'd have stayed? That's rich. She worked herself to death. 2 jobs, no help. While you were what? Building your empire? You're on the news now, some big shot with a secret kid. You think I want your pity?" "I don't pity you," Thomas said, his eyes locking with Ethan's. "I respect you. I see her in you, her strength, her grit. I came because you deserve to know the truth, not because I expect anything." Ethan turned away, running a hand through his hair, his breath ragged. "She never talked about you. Not once. Said my dad was gone, that's it. Then she's dying, coughing up blood, and I'm holding her hand in some shitty hospital room. Where were you then?" Thomas felt the words like a blade, but he didn't look away. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low, steady. "I was building a life I thought mattered. Money, power. I didn't know she was suffering or that you existed. I can't change that, but I'm here now." Ethan spun back, his eyes blazing. "Here now? For what? To ease your guilt? I don't need you, Carver. I've made it this far without you." "I know," Thomas said, and for the first time his voice softened, a crack in the steel. "You're tougher than I ever was, but I'm not here for me. I'm here for you, for her. She deserved better than I gave her." Ethan stared at him, chest heaving, then grabbed a rag and wiped his hands, the motion sharp, deliberate. "You don't get to waltz in and fix this," he said. "You don't get to make it right with a speech." "I'm not trying to fix it," Thomas replied. "I'm trying to face it. I'll go if you want me to, but if you'll let me, I'd like to know you, not as a boss, not as a savior, as your father." Ethan tossed the rag aside, his jaw tight, and pointed to the Chevy. "That was hers," he said, his voice quieter now, raw. "She drove it till it broke down, then taught me how to fix it. Said it was ours. You don't get to claim that. Or me." Thomas nodded, his gaze lingering on the car. "I remember it," he said, almost to himself. "She loved that blue. Used to sing while I fumbled with the tires." His eyes met Ethan's again, steady but unguarded. "I don't want to claim you, Ethan. I want to earn a place, if you'll give me one. Ethan didn't answer, just turned back to the engine, his hands resuming their work. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken things, but Thomas didn't push. He'd said what he came to say. Honor wasn't in forcing this, it was in standing here, taking the rejection and leaving the door open. Get out, Ethan said finally, not looking up. I need to think. Thomas inclined his head, a quiet acknowledgement, and walked back to his car. The gravel crunched underfoot, the street lamp flickering as he slid behind the wheel. Through the open bay, he watched Ethan wrench at the engine. His movements fierce but controlled. Claire's son, his son. The ache in his chest was sharp now, but he didn't let it break him. He'd face the truth, and that was enough for tonight. The engine purred to life, and Thomas drove into the dark, the garage lights fading in his mirror. He'd return, not to demand, but to prove. Dignity was in the long game, and he'd play it with every ounce of strength he had. Thomas Carver stood at the window of the Carver Industries boardroom, the Chicago skyline a steel-gray expanse beneath, a sky bruised with clouds. The rain had returned, streaking the glass in relentless rivulets, mirroring the turmoil that had shadowed him since Brooklyn. 3 days had passed since he'd faced Ethan, since the truth had spilled out under the zero. Garage lights, raw and jagged. The boy's rejection stung, but Thomas hadn't faltered. His resolve was iron, forged in the quiet vow to prove himself worthy, not just to Ethan, but to the memory of Claire. The boardroom door clicked open behind him, and he turned. Hands clasped behind his back, his suit pressed to perfection despite the sleepless nights. Evelyn Harper entered first, her silver hair a beacon of authority, followed by the rest of the board, 6 faces etched with unease. At the rear came Daniel Pierce, his lean frame draped in a charcoal suit, a smirk playing on his lips like a predator scenting blood. The air thickened with the scent of coffee and tension, the overhead lights casting stark shadows across the mahogany table. Thomas, Evelyn began, her voice steady but laced with urgency. We've got a problem. A big one. She slid a tablet across the table, its screen glowing with a new headline. Carver's shame, abandoned son and a dying lover. Below it, an audiophile icon pulsed red. Thomas's chest tightened, but his face remained a mask of calm. He tapped the screen, and Claire's voice filled the room, soft, broken, trembling with sickness. Thomas, if you're out there, please come back. Ethan needs you. I'm not going to make it much longer. The recording cut off, leaving a silence that pressed against his ribs like a vice. Pierce leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Found that little gem in an old hospital archive, he said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. She called for you, Tommy, begged, and you were too busy counting your billions to care. The board shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting, between Thomas and Pierce. Evelyn's jaw tightened. The stock's plummeting, 10% since this hit the wires an hour ago. Shareholders are furious. The press is camped outside. Pierce says he's got more. Letters, witnesses. He's demanding your resignation, Thomas, or he'll bury us. Thomas didn't move, didn't blink. The sound of Claire's voice echoed in his skull. Her plea a knife twisting in the wound he'd carried since the letter arrived. He saw her now, pale, fragile, alone in a hospital bed, Ethan at her side while he sat in this very room, signing deals that meant nothing compared to her life. His hands clenched behind his back, but his voice, when it came, was low, unshaken. What do you want, Daniel? Pierce grinned, leaning forward. Step down. Hand me the reins. You're a liability now. A deadbeat dad with a sob story the public's eating up. I'll save the company from your mess, the board murmured, a ripple of agreement and doubt. Michael Reed, the COO, cleared his throat. He's got a point, Thomas. The optics are brutal. We can't weather this if you stay. Thomas turned back to the window, the rain a steady drumbeat against the glass. He could fight, call Pierce's, bluff, spin the narrative, dig up dirt of his own. He'd built this empire with his bare hands, outmaneuvered men like Pierce a dozen times. But Claire's voice lingered, her words a mirror to the man he'd become. Cold, distant, a fortress, of success with no one inside. Honor wasn't in clinging to power. It was in facing the cost of his choices. He turned to face them, his gray eyes steady, his posture unbowed. "You want my resignation?" he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You've got it. Effective immediately. I won't let this company or Ethan pay for my past." A gasp rippled through the board. Evelyn's eyes widened. "Thomas, think this through. We can manage—" "No," he interrupted, firm, but not harsh. "I've thought it through. Pierce can have the chair. I'm done here." Pierce's smirk faltered, surprise flickering in his gaze. He'd expected a fight, a crack in Thomas's armor, but Thomas gave him nothing. No anger, no desperation. Just a quiet, deliberate surrender that stole the victory's sting. Thomas crossed to the table, picked up the tablet, and played Claire's recording again, letting her voice fill the silence. When it ended, he set it down gently, his fingers lingering on the screen. "I didn't hear that call when it mattered," he said, addressing the room but looking at Pierce. "I didn't know she was dying or that I had a son. I built all this." He gestured to the room, the skyline beyond, thinking it was enough. "I was wrong. You win, Daniel, but not because you broke me, because I choose something else." He walked to the door, the board watching in stunned silence. Pierce called after him. "You're throwing away everything, Tommy. For what?" Thomas paused, hand on the knob, and glanced back. "For what I should have kept 25 years ago. You wouldn't understand." He stepped into the hall, the door closing softly behind him. The elevator ride down was a descent into stillness, the hum of the machinery a counterpoint to the chaos he'd left behind. Reporters swarmed the lobby, their shouts a dull roar through the glass, but Thomas didn't stop. He walked past them, head high, hands in his pockets, his silence louder than their questions. Security cleared a path to his car, and he drove into the rain, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and gray. Alone, he pulled the Polaroid from his coat, Claire and him, laughing under that street lamp, and traced her face with his thumb. His eyes burned, but no tears fell. He'd lost the company, the throne he'd built, but he hadn't lost himself. Dignity wasn't in the boardroom anymore. It was in the sacrifice, in the choice to protect Ethan from the fallout. Pierce could have the empire. Thomas would rebuild something truer. The rain battered the windshield, but he drove on, steady, unshaken. Claire's voice lingered, a call he'd answer now, not with words, but with action. He'd go back to Brooklyn, not as a tycoon, but as a man, a father, ready to face whatever came next. The lights of Chicago faded behind him, and for the first time in decades, Thomas felt the weight lift, replaced by a quiet strength he'd forgotten he had. The small house on the edge of Brooklyn smelled of yeast and roasted garlic, a warmth that seeped into Thomas Carver's bones as he stood at the stove, stirring a pot of marinara. It was a far cry from the penthouse kitchens he'd once commanded, with their stainless steel and hired chefs. But this cramped space, wood-paneled walls, a chipped linoleum floor, felt more real than anything he'd known in years. A single bulb hung over the dining table, casting a soft golden glow across the mismatched chairs. And outside, the November wind rattled the windows of the modest rental he'd taken after leaving Chicago. Thomas adjusted the flame, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, hands steady despite the weight of the day. It had been a week since he'd walked away from Carver Industries, since he'd handed Pierce the keys to his empire under the boardroom lights. The press had roared, "Tycoon falls and family scandal." But Thomas hadn't flinched. He'd come to Brooklyn with a suitcase and a purpose, renting this house a mile from Ethan's garage. Tonight he'd invited Ethan and Sarah, the quiet young woman he'd seen at the shop, for dinner. No grand gestures, no demands, just a meal, a chance. The doorbell buzzed, sharp against the hum of the stove. Thomas wiped his hands on a dish, towel, smoothing his shirt, and opened the door. Ethan stood there, hair damp from the drizzle, his flannel jacket slung over a plain tee. Beside him, Sarah, petite with auburn curls, offered a small smile, holding a bottle of cheap red wine. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice gruff, eyes wary. "We're here. Come in," Thomas said, stepping aside, his tone warm but not pushy. "It's good to see you." They entered, Ethan's boots leaving faint muddy prints on the floor, Sarah's gaze darting around the sparse room, a couch, a coffee table, a stack of books Thomas had brought from Chicago. "Smells nice," she said, setting the wine down. "You cook?" "Used to," Thomas replied, nodding toward the kitchen. "Claire taught me. Haven't done it in a while." Ethan's jaw tightened at the mention of his mother, but he didn't speak, just sat at the table, arms crossed. Thomas returned to the stove, pulling a loaf of bread from the oven, golden, crusty, the way Claire had made it when they were young. He sliced it, the knife's rhythm steadying him, and brought it to the table with a bowl of pasta and sauce. "It's simple," he said, sitting across from Ethan. "Hope it's enough." Sarah spooned pasta onto her plate, breaking the silence. "It's great. Thanks for having us." Ethan grunted, serving himself, his movements stiff but not hostile. They ate quietly at first, the clink of forks against plates a fragile bridge over the gulf between them. Thomas took a sip of wine, the cheap tang sharp on his tongue, and set the glass down. "I'm not with the company anymore," he said, his voice even, meeting Ethan's eyes. "Resigned last week. Thought you should know." Ethan paused, fork midair, his brow furrowing. "What? Why?" "The scandal. Pierce, the press. It was going to drag you into it too. I didn't want that." Thomas leaned back, hands resting on the table. "I gave it up. Sold my shares, moved here, figured it was time to stop running." Ethan stared, the fork lowering slowly. "You walked away from all that. For me, for you, for Claire." Thomas's gaze didn't waver. "I owed her that much. Owed you." Sarah glanced between them, her eyes soft but Ethan's hardened. "You think a dinner and some noble quit fixes 25 years? You don't get to play hero now." "I'm not playing anything," Thomas said, his voice firm but calm. "I'm not here to fix it, Ethan. I'm here to face it. I've got no company, no empire, just this. If you want me gone, I'll go. But I'd rather stay." Ethan pushed, his plate away, leaning forward, his voice low. "She left something for you. Didn't want to give it up, but maybe you should hear it." He pulled a small recorder from his pocket, its plastic scratched and worn, and pressed play. Claire's voice crackled through, weaker than the hospital recording, but clear. "Thomas, if you're hearing this, Ethan's found you. I don't blame you, I never did. You were scared and I let you go. Just take care of him now. He's all I've got left." The words hung in the air, a whisper from the grave that pierced Thomas's chest. His eyes burned, but he didn't look away, didn't let the tears fall. Claire's forgiveness, so undeserved, so pure, cut deeper than any accusation. He saw her in his mind, frail but fierce, recording this for a man she hadn't seen in decades. For him. Ethan clicked the recorder off, his hand shaking slightly. She made that a week before she died. Kept it in her jewelry box. Said if I ever met you to play it. I didn't want to. Thought you didn't deserve it. "I don't," Thomas said, his voice raw but steady. "But she did. She always saw more in me than I did." Sarah reached for Ethan's hand, squeezing it, her eyes glistening. Ethan pulled back, standing abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "I don't know what to do with this," he said, his voice cracking. "You're here, cooking her recipes, acting like you care. I spent years hating a ghost, and now you're real. And I—" He stopped, fists clenching, then turned to Thomas. "Why didn't you fight for her?" Thomas stood slow and deliberate, meeting Ethan's gaze. "I was a coward then. Thought success was honor. That leaving kept her free. I was wrong. I can't fight for her now, but I can fight for you, if you'll let me." Ethan's breath hitched, and he sank back into the chair, head in his hands. Sarah moved to his side, whispering something Thomas couldn't hear. After a long moment, Ethan looked up, eyes red but fierce. I don't forgive you, not yet, but she did. So I'll try. For her. Thomas nodded, a quiet weight lifting. That's enough, he said. More than I deserve. They sat again, the meal resuming in silence, but it wasn't cold anymore. Just heavy, tender. Thomas watched Ethan eat, Claire's voice echoing in his mind, and felt the first stirrings of something new. Dignity wasn't in the resignation. It was here, in this small house under these dim lights, with a son who might one day call him father. The bread cooled on the table, and outside, the wind softened, as if the storm had finally passed. Yow. Late November sun dipped low over Brooklyn, painting the sky in streaks of amber and violet as Thomas Carver tightened a bolt on the old blue Chevy parked outside Bennett's Auto. The garage's gravel lot crunched under his boots, a sound that had become familiar in the weeks since he'd left Chicago behind. His hands, once pristine and suited for boardroom pens, were now flecked with grease, calluses forming where cufflinks used to sit. Beside him, Ethan adjusted the carburetor, his movements swift and sure, a quiet rhythm they'd fallen into without words. It had been a month since the dinner, since Claire's voice had bridged the gap between them, fragile but unbreakable. Thomas had stayed, renting the small house a mile away, trading his tailored suits for flannel and denim. He didn't push Ethan, didn't demand forgiveness, just showed up. Mornings at the garage, evenings with coffee or a sandwich, a steady presence that spoke louder than apologies. Ethan hadn't called him Dad, but the silences had softened, the sharp edges of their early encounters dulled by time and shared work. "Hand me the wrench," Ethan said, breaking the quiet, his voice gruff but not cold. Thomas passed it over, their fingers brushing briefly, and felt a flicker of something warm. Pride, maybe, or hope. The Chevy gleamed under the fading light, its chipped blue paint restored, a tribute to Claire they'd rebuilt together. She'd loved this car, driven it until it coughed its last, and now it purred again, a piece of her alive in their hands. "Runs good," Thomas said, stepping back to wipe his brow. "She'd be proud." Ethan straightened, tossing the wrench into the toolbox with a clank. "Yeah, she would." He glanced at Thomas, his hazel eyes, Claire's eyes, searching, then softening. "You didn't have to stick around, you know. Could have gone back to your fancy life." Thomas shook his head, leaning against the car. "That life's gone. Sold the penthouse, cashed out my shares. This," he gestured to the garage, the Chevy, the twilight settling over them. "This is what matters now." Ethan snorted, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "You're a shitty mechanic, though." "Getting better," Thomas replied, matching the smile. "Had a good teacher." They stood there, the air crisp with the scent of oil and fallen leaves, a moment of ease that felt earned. Thomas had given up Carver Industries, walked away from the empire he'd built, but he hadn't lost himself. He'd found something truer. Honor wasn't in the headlines or the boardroom. It was here, in the gravel dust, in the son who'd let him stay. Sarah appeared at the garage door, her auburn curls catching the last light, a stack of flyers in her hands. "Ready for tonight?" she asked, her voice bright. "Folks are starting to show up." Thomas nodded, brushing his hands on his jeans. Tonight was Ethan's idea, a community night at the garage, a fundraiser for kids without parents, something Claire had dreamed of in her final days. They'd fixed up old cars, collected donations, turned the lot into a gathering place with string lights and folding tables. It wasn't grand, not like the galas Thomas once hosted, but it felt right, simple, real. The evening unfolded under a canopy of stars, the string lights twinkling like fireflies over the growing crowd. Neighbors milled about, kids darted between, cars, and a local band strummed acoustic tunes from a makeshift stage. Thomas manned a table, handing out cups of cider, his flannel shirt rolled up, a quiet smile on his face as he watched Ethan work the grill, flipping burgers with Sarah at his side. The Chevy sat parked nearby, its hood up, a centerpiece that drew nods and stories from old-timers who'd known Claire. "She'd love this," Ethan said later, joining Thomas with a beer in hand, the crowd's laughter a soft hum behind them. Mom always talked about helping kids like me, ones who didn't have much. She was good like that, Thomas said, his voice low, steady. Better than me. Ethan took a sip, his gaze distant. You're not so bad. Took me a while. To see it. Thomas looked at him, the words sinking in, a weight lifting he hadn't known he carried. I don't deserve that yet, he said, but I'll keep trying. Ethan shrugged, a small, honest gesture. You're here. That's something. They stood together watching the night unfold, kids chasing each other, Sarah chatting, with a neighbor, the Chevy gleaming under the lights. Thomas thought of Claire, her laughter echoing in his memory, and felt her presence in this moment. Not a ghost, but a light that guided him still. He'd walked away from power to find this, a life not of wealth but of worth, built on sweat and patience and the son who'd given him a chance. As the crowd thinned, Thomas and Ethan cleaned up, stacking chairs, folding tables. The last stragglers, left with smiles and promises to return, the fundraiser a quiet success. Sarah kissed Ethan goodbye, heading home, and Thomas locked the garage, the keys cold in his hand. They walked to the Chevy, its engine cooling under the stars, and stood in companionable silence. I'm keeping this, Ethan said, patting the hood. But you can drive it sometimes, if you don't screw it up. Thomas chuckled, the sound, soft in the night. Deal, I'll stick to the passenger seat for now. Ethan grinned, then hesitated, his hand lingering on the car. She'd be glad you're here, he said, almost a whisper. Not perfect, but here. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. I'm not going anywhere. They parted then. Ethan to his apartment, Thomas to his rented house, two figures under the streetlights, connected by a thread Claire had woven long ago. Thomas walked home, the air cold against his skin, but inside he felt warm, steady. He'd lost an empire, but he'd gained a legacy, not in boardrooms, but in this quiet corner of Brooklyn, where a car ran smooth and a son looked at him with something like trust. The lights of the city glowed in the distance, a reminder of what he'd left behind. But here, under the stars, a different light burned. One he'd kindled with his own hands, one that wouldn't fade. Dignity wasn't in the past victories or the headlines. It was in this moment, in the man he'd become for Ethan, for Claire, for himself. He unlocked his door, stepped inside, and turned on a single lamp. The glow was small, but it was enough.